Ever notice how those Korean gangster films, the ones with the crazy fight scenes and the loyalty and betrayal, like all mixed into one, they just hit differently? We were going deep on this one. Kkangpae,
Yeah.
the infamous gangsters of South Korea. But how much of what we see on screen, with the slick suits and the swagger, how much of that is rooted in reality?
Well, I think that's what's so fascinating about this topic, right? There's this inherent contradiction. I mean, we often use terms like Kkangpae and organized crime kind of interchangeably.
Right.
But in Korea, there's a real distinction.
So, even before we get to the bigger, crime syndicates, there's a whole Kkangpae 101 we got to cover.
Absolutely. It's like laying the foundation.
Yeah.
Because you have the Kkangpae, which are more those street-level operators focused on local influence, turf wars, and their origins. Way more complex than you might think.
All right, so this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because our sources, they took us all the way back to the late 1800s, Joseon Dynasty, which, I'll be honest, my knowledge of that period, pretty limited. Silks, calligraphy, not exactly a gangster's paradise, right?
Well, not quite. You got to picture this. Increasing trade, foreign influence pouring in, society changing rapidly. It's a recipe for instability. And where there's instability,
Someone's looking to capitalize.
Exactly.
So maybe less about gangsters in silk robes, more about how these shifts in society, they kind of create the need for alternative forms of power. Would that be accurate?
100%. And those power dynamics get a whole lot more complicated as we move into the 20th century, specifically with Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910.
Right.
Because now it's not just about internal Korean power struggles anymore. It's about survival.
Yeah.
It's about navigating oppression under colonial rule.
And this is where Kim Duhan enters the picture, right? Almost like a Robin Hood-esque figure rose within the Kkangpae world during Japanese rule. I mean, his story alone could be a movie.
Oh, absolutely. Kim Duhan is essential to understanding this period. Imagine this. You're a young Korean man, right? Facing discrimination, violence, maybe even forced labor.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of anger, a lot of resentment.
Yeah.
And Kim Duhan, he tapped into that.
Right.
But he didn't just fight against the Japanese. He unified Korean gangs who were often at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And even went head-to-head with the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia.
It's giving me Peaky Blinders vibes, but with a Korean twist.
It's the perfect example of this duality we see with the Kkangpae. On one hand, they're fighting for Korean interests, unifying against a common enemy. But on the other, their methods.
Yeah.
They involve the same violence, the same criminal activity that would later come to define them. And I think that's what makes them so compelling on screen,
Yeah. It makes you question everything.
Exactly.
Here's this guy, Kim Duhan, goes from street tough to a politician later in life. It's it really shows you how those lines between the criminal world and what we think of as legitimate power, they're really blurry.
Completely.
So we've got this compelling origin story now. Kkangpae emerging from this tumultuous period, even find a folk hero in Kim Duhan. But then what happens? Korea's liberated shades of gray, lots of shades of gray. But this whole Kkangpae as protector thing, even though it was kind of messy, it didn't last forever, did it? What happened?
No, you're right, it didn't. As Korea moves into the 1960s, things change pretty drastically. You have Park Chung-hee's government. They're really focused on stability, consolidating power.
Right.
And they saw Kkangpae as a direct threat to that.
So back to the shadows for our Kkangpae friends.
Pretty much.
I got a feeling this isn't the last we hear of them, though.
You might be right about that.
Knowing their history, they don't seem like the type to just disappear.
Right. You know your Kkangpae history, the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Those were a real turning point for these groups. Remember how we were talking about their hierarchical structures earlier?
Right.
Those became way more defined during this period.
They were taking notes from, the mafia.
Exactly. We start to see this really clear shift towards organization. Clear ranks, codes of conduct.
Okay.
And unfortunately, a huge escalation in violence as well.
So it's less knives in back alleys, more
guns, more brutal tactics.
So long gone are those honorable gangster days, huh?
Pretty much. The image of the Kkangpae you see in those gritty crime films.
Yeah.
The ones that make you think man, who am I rooting for here?
Right.
That really starts to solidify during this time. And remember how they have their hands in some legitimate businesses back in the 50s?
Yeah.
That becomes a way bigger deal now. We're talking construction, entertainment, even politics. They had their fingers in everything.
See, that's what I think is so unnerving. It's one thing to have street gangs, right? But when they're, like, woven into the fabric of society, calling the shots behind the scenes.
It's a whole other level.
Yeah.
It's that classic story of power corrupting.
Right.
And unfortunately, the 80s in South Korea, that was fertile ground for that corruption. But you know what they say? What goes up
Must come down.
Exactly. And for Kkangpae, the 90s brought a whole renewed effort to dismantle their operations.
This is where Article 114 comes in, right?
That's the one.
I remember our sources mentioned that one. Didn't that basically outlaw organized crime groups entirely? Like, just being part of one was a crime.
That's exactly it. It wasn't just
Yeah.
about prosecuting individual crimes anymore, you know?
Yeah.
Simply being a member of Kkangpae, that was enough to land you in some serious trouble.
Wow.
It was a huge crackdown, forced a lot of them into hiding, out of the country even.
So that's it then, right? Case closed, problem solved. Kkangpae's story ends with a whimper.
I wish it were that easy. See, the 90s also brought about the age of globalization.
Right.
Which, while generally a good thing, it also opened up these new avenues for transnational crime. Kkangpae weren't confined to Korea's borders anymore.
Oh,
They had these overseas connections, new markets for all their illicit activities. Everything changed.
So even with Article 114 and everything, it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? They just kept adapting,
All the time.
finding new ways to do what they do, but now on a global scale.
Exactly. And we're not talking about petty theft here. You know,
Right.
drug smuggling, human
Yeah.
trafficking, extortion, that's all part of their repertoire, even today.
It's easy to forget that, I think. You know, when you see the movies, you get caught up in the storylines.
Yeah.
But these are criminal organizations at the end of the day, right?
Reality.
Driven by profit, power, and the fact that they can just, like, evolve and exploit new opportunities like that, it makes them a very real threat, even now.
Absolutely. It's a global issue. But I think to fully grasp just how complex Kkangpae really is, we need to go beyond just their activities
Okay.
and look at what makes them so visually distinct.
You're talking about the tattoos, the territories,
These-
all those elements that make them instantly recognizable, even if it's not always so obvious to the untrained eye.
Right.
Let's start with the tattoos. Those are pretty central to Kkangpae culture, but I'm guessing it's more than just wanting to look tough, right?
Oh, for sure. Think of it more like a secret language, a way for these gangs to communicate affiliation, hierarchy within their ranks, often hidden in plain sight.
Hidden in plain sight. That's interesting. What makes them so secretive?
Well, it's like each gang will have their own specific symbols, right? Like animals,
Yeah.
historical figures, even like, intricate designs, all inked onto their members. It's like a visual shorthand. Speaks volumes to those in the, within the Kkangpae world.
Right.
But to just openly display those markings, way too risky.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like a secret handshake, but with way higher stakes.
It's
Wouldn't want to be walking around advertising your affiliation to rival gangs, or the police for that matter.
Right. So those tattoos, they're this discreet way to signal allegiance, status, especially in a society where being so open about gang activity, not exactly encouraged.
Right.
And it's that societal context, I think, that really adds another layer to all of this, don't you think?
Wait, are you talking about how tattoos, like, in general, are still kind of taboo in South Korea? Because we see them all the time in K-dramas and movies, even on some K-pop idols, right? It's like, it seems pretty mainstream these days.
And that's what's so interesting, right? There's this real contradiction.
Yeah.
Because, there's definitely this growing acceptance of tattoos, especially, like, the younger generations.
Right.
But for a lot of older Koreans, tattoos, they still equal criminality, gangs.
Huh. So it's almost like this weird double standard.
In a way, yeah. On the one hand, it's becoming more popular, even trendy, right? But it's still got this stigma attached to it.
Yeah, that connection to the underworld.
And it goes even deeper than that, though. Because, like, in South Korea, there's actually a law that, like, heavily restricts who can even give tattoos.
Really?
It's a really tightly controlled practice, which I think only adds to the whole mystique, especially when it comes to Kkangpae.
Wow. So those hidden tattoos really, really say a lot, huh? They're like a secret code, a societal, like, transgression.
And this powerful visual, all in one.
Exactly. It's no wonder they're so captivating on screen, right?
Yeah.
Instantly conveys danger, living outside the lines.
Right.
But there's another marker of Kkangpae influence we should unpack, and it's a little less visible.
Okay.
Gayok.
Right. Our sources mention that one that literally translates to territory, right? But I'm guessing it's not just about, lines on a map.
Oh, it's way more than that. Think of Gayok as like a Kkangpae's domain. Their sphere of influence.
Yeah.
It's their turf. And they're very serious about defending it.
So it's like, this street corner, that's mine. That bar, yours. Don't even think about setting foot in my Gayok. Something like that.
Exactly. But it's not all about bragging rights, you see. Control over a Gayok, that means real economic power.
Right. Which brings us to the whole protection racket thing.
Unfortunately.
That not so subtle art of, hey, that's a nice little business you got there. Be ashamed if something were to happen to it.
Right.
Sadly, yes. That was their bread and butter for a long time. Kkangpae would offer protection to businesses in their Gayok. For a price, of course.
Right.
And refusal to pay up. Let's just say it usually didn't end well.
It's like a messed up version of a neighborhood watch.
Right.
With a bit of extortion on the side.
Exactly.
So we've got these fascinating contradictions, right? Like baked right into Kkangpae culture. This back and forth between what they actually do and how they're shown in movies and TV and everything. And makes me wonder, like, why are they so often romanticized, even like glamorized on screen?
That's a great question. I think it speaks to this fascination we all have with stories about rebellion, loyalty, people who live by their own code. I mean, think about some of those classic Korean gangster films, right? Friend, A Bittersweet Life, even Lucy. Which, while not strictly a Kkangpae movie, it definitely deals with similar themes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, some great movies in there. And they all tap into something that's kind of universally appealing, you know? Because who hasn't felt like an outsider at some point? Someone who, like, questions authority, wants to make their own way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's also a danger in romanticizing these groups too much, you know? Especially given what we know they're actually involved in.
Oh, for sure. It's a tough line to walk.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, these stories can be super compelling, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Exploring brotherhood, loyalty, the struggle for identity, all of that.
Right.
But we also got to be mindful of the very real harm these organizations cause.
Yeah. It's about understanding the full picture, isn't it?
Exactly.
The good, the bad, and the really, really bad.
And that's, I think, what's so great about a deep dive like this, you know?
Right.
We've explored their history, how complex their evolution has been, their visual markers, their influence on Korean society as a whole.
It is a wild story when you lay it all out like this.
It really is. Full of these contradictions, these really thought-provoking nuances.
We've gone from the streets of, like, Japanese-occupied Korea all the way to, like, the globalized world of transnational crime. We've seen how these groups have been demonized, romanticized, feared, and even in some ways admired.
It's complicated.
Yeah. So to everyone listening out there, we'll leave you with this. How has this deep dive challenged or maybe even confirmed your own perceptions of Kkangpae? Keep that in mind the next time you see these, compelling figures pop up on screen.
Food for thought.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.